Hi everyone, so this is your short lecture on the soul-making theodicy. Okay, so the soul-making theodicy is a way to attempt to explain why is that evil exists in the world and how that evil can be compatible with the big three God. Okay, so as I kind of previewed in the last video a little bit, the soul-making theodicy takes a little different approach than the free will theodicy. And really what it's saying is that, okay, look, so one feature of the soul-making theodicy, is that it claims that humans have free will. All right, a lot of people think we have free will. Let's just assume that's the case. Okay, so humans have free will. We'll talk about whether that's the case later on in the course. But suppose we have free will. All right. From the fact we have free will, we make mistakes, right? All the time, right? To err is to be human, right? That's in other words, to make mistakes is to be human, right? It's a really sort of common idea, right? We make mistakes all the time. And it's mistakes that usually cost us something in the process, right? It somehow might hurt us. But what the soul-making theodicy is going to say is that, well, wait a second, though. When we make mistakes, we build our souls, and the hardships that we endure from life make us better off than if we didn't have them. We didn't have these hardships, okay? So why do the various evils in the world exist? It's because people make mistakes and they act in evil ways. But these evils sometimes make us better off than if they never existed. Okay. So let's look at this on a kind of like a small scale level. I think the soul-making theodicy tends to work really well on a sort of small level, so let's just talk about it like that for a second here. So, as I said, suffering you might think is a kind of evil, okay? So I'll share a little something about myself. I tend not to talk about myself very much, but one thing I'll share about myself is that, so when I was in high school, actually, a while ago, feels like ages. But anyway, when I was in high school, I used to weigh 100 more pounds than I do currently. I was very obese, okay? And I eventually decided that I wanted to lose weight, and I did. And now I'm at a healthy weight. And I suffered from being obese. I was starting to develop health problems. It took a toll on me psychologically, and I'm not saying that this is the case for all people who are obese, but at least for me and for lots of people who are, those are common things that occur, okay? And I was suffering as a result of it, okay? But in the process of losing weight, and you hear this a lot, not just in my story, but you hear this a lot too in stories of people who lose weight, you sort of get a new perspective on things, right? And you sort of gain things that you wouldn't have otherwise had before. So one thing that I had to do that I don't think I would have had if I wasn't obese and then lost the weight is I had to become very disciplined as a person. I had to learn to self-discipline myself because no one else was going to lose the weight for me. I had to do it myself, and I had to force myself to do it. So there's some self-discipline that came with that, okay? And self-discipline's a really hard thing to get, right? And there's other ways you can get self-discipline. I'm not saying that anyone who's overweight isn't self-disciplined, but that's a way that I got self-discipline. For me, at least, I was able to gain discipline in my life through exercise, okay? That helped me become a disciplined person. And I think I'm better off having been obese and lost that weight because I wouldn't have been disciplined. If I was always this current weight, I don't think I would have the sort of discipline I have currently, right? So I was kind of better off suffering earlier on in my life to then get this benefit of having some kind of self-discipline, okay? So that's sort of one thing, right? So some people might relate to that, okay? So I was better off as a result of that. Some people also think that other sorts of hardships in our life sort of build our souls and make us better. Right? Think of something maybe in your life, maybe kind of like something that I shared, right, about the weight loss. You can maybe think of something that you might think, at the time, I thought that was like a really bad thing. And maybe it was in the short term it was. And maybe in the long term it could have been, okay? But usually people can think of something in their lives that because that thing happened, even though it was bad at the time, eventually you gain something from it, you learn something from it, right? If you made a mistake, you might have learned from your mistake. You might have gained a valuable lesson from that mistake, okay? I can think of plenty of times where I made mistakes and I haven't learned from my mistakes, and it sucks that it happened, but you gain something from it that you wouldn't have gotten before, right? So, when I was, I'll share one more thing about myself. This is from high school again, it's fine, whatever. So, when I was in high school, for instance, I was I was kind of like a loner, right? I'm fine now, but I was a loner in high school, okay? And as a result, I sort of felt that I made a mistake by not being as social maybe as I could have been, okay? But one thing I gained from being a loner, and I'm not anymore, but when I was a loner, one thing I gained from that is I was able to be happy with myself and be content with myself. And that's also something that's really valuable, you might think. I don't think I would have ever gotten that if I wasn't a loner back in high school. I'm not saying that all loners are going to be like that and whatever, okay? But that's something that I got, okay? And that was a kind of hardship in a way. Sometimes it was lonely being a loner, right? But eventually I learned to appreciate my own company, right? Most of the time at least. But anyway, so I was able to gain some things through hardships. Okay, and that's what the soul-making theodicy is really getting at, right? The idea is that people are suffering hardships and they make mistakes, and as a result, people are better off. Okay, you gain something from it. Right? Even with natural evils, you might think this is the case, right? So think about like when maybe that was a little past a lot of your time. But I'll just talk about like a hypothetical scenario here. But like, so many times when tsunamis hit like island nations, and particularly developing island nations, or just think of some big natural disaster that occurs, one thing that usually happens is that it'll gain international attention, and then everybody sort of bands together to sort of say, okay, we need to help these people recover from this tragedy, this natural tragedy. And you might think, that evil, that natural evil, if that didn't occur, we wouldn't have all banded together in that time. And you might have thought that sort of solidarity is something that's really important, right? Acting charitably, like many people would in those sorts of cases, would not have occurred had that natural evil not occurred, okay? Sometimes those sorts of tragedies bring out the best in people, right? And that wouldn't have been there if those evils weren't there to begin with, okay? So the soul-making theodicy is sort of saying, like, it's helping us become better people when there's evil in the world, okay? And you can look at your reading some more about sort of how the author that we're looking at is defending this view, but that's the idea. Okay. So the one main objection to the soul-making theodicy is that even though the sorts of, in some cases you might call them evils, the evils I talked about, the natural evils I talked about, that's a straightforward evil. The maybe sort of suffering that, for instance, I maybe endured in high school when I was overweight or obese or whatever, that you might have thought is maybe unnecessary suffering. It might have been like an evil towards myself, depends how you look at it, like I wasn't taking care of myself, so I was sort of causing myself this pain. Maybe you might think it's a natural evil because it's a natural evil that our bodies act in a way that if you're a certain weight, that these things happen to you, okay? However you want to think about it, I was suffering, okay? So in those sorts of cases, I think people can kind of say like, oh yeah, I can see how that might make you better off and that's a good thing and whatever. The big issue is that you can probably think of plenty of evils that people aren't better off from, or it just seems excessive. So it might be true, right? It might totally be true that having some kinds of hardships in your life makes you better off if you didn't have them. But does that mean that we need all the evils that are currently going on in the world in order to build our character, right? So do we need systemic racism in the world to be better people? I'm kind of doubtful of that, right? Right. I don't see why that's a necessary thing to have in the world. Where if we didn't have systemic racism, that we would be worse off as people, right? If anything, we're fighting it. A related objection is that so one objection is that there's lots of seemingly unnecessary evils that not only don't help our character but just make us worse off, like systemic racism, right? You might also think of cases of trauma. So lots of people who suffer from traumatic events or maybe have PTSD. PTSD, especially in really severe forms, there's various levels of it, but in very severe forms, you might think that there is no soul-making benefit to that. You're just worse off as a person because of this unfortunate thing that happened to you, which oftentimes can be these sorts of moral evils, okay? Think of like veterans, for instance. All right.